everybody, and welcome to Project HR, a podcast dedicated to building better workplaces. I'm Jennifer Oraqua, COO of Projections, and your host for today's episode. Now, of course, here on Project HR, we talk a lot about encouraging the maintenance of a positive, collaborative workplace. It's one of HR's primary goals. But sometimes that goal can be tough to achieve, and one of the most challenging times for maintaining that positivity can be during a heated political campaign. Not long from now, the U.S. will face one of the most divisive presidential elections in its history. And despite the fact that many Americans are now working from home, toxic behavior, including campaign rhetoric, can still make its way into your workspaces, deeply impacting your team's current and future harmony and productivity. What can we do as leaders and HR professionals to head off this damage? And are we too late to prevent it from happening this campaign cycle? Today, we're joined by Abigail Johnson Hess, a careers reporter with CNBC Make It, who has written on this very topic, and she's going to help us better understand what's at stake. We're so happy you're here, Abigail.
Thanks for having me.
Well, it's great to have you on Project HR. Before we get started, for our listeners at home, right, left, and otherwise minded, I want to let everybody know that this is going to be a nonpartisan discussion. We aren't talking about the actual politics here. We're talking about the strong feelings that politics can inspire in your workers and the impact that those feelings can have on the workplace. So with that understood, let's get into it. So Abigail, as we mentioned, you're a careers reporter with CNBC Make It. Can you tell us a little bit about this division within CNBC.com and your role in it?
Yeah. CNBC Make It is part of CNBC's newsroom that has a specific mission to make people smarter about how they make, spend, and save their money. I focus on the changing ways people learn and work. And, we think a lot about workplaces on my team. We think a lot about what it means to work, how people feel when they work, and politics definitely plays a role in that.
Okay. So clearly you're tapped into the latest in business and finance. Has the election's impact on the workforce been a particular point of concern this year for you and your team?
A point of concern is a good way to put it. I mean, I think we spend a lot of time thinking about workplaces. We spend so much of our lives at work. Politics shapes every aspect of our lives. I think we knew going into this year that it was definitely, there was going to be some merging of those two subject areas for sure.
So earlier this year, you wrote an article, which is kind of what sparked our interest in having you on, that talked about a new study about politics in the workplace. Can you tell us a little bit more about that study itself and, of course, your article?
Yeah, so I've been following these studies and surveys on the subject of politics in the workplace for over a year now, right? As we were kind of ramping up towards November 20. Back in November 2019, a survey from the Society of Human Resources Management found that 42% of U.S. employees say they have personally experienced a political disagreement at work. And I've been following the subject ever since. A February 2020 Glassdoor poll found that 57% of workers say they've talked about politics while on the job. And most recently, a survey from Gartner found that 78% of people talk about politics at work, and 47% of people say that the 2020 presidential election has impacted their ability to get work done. So steadily, we've seen that these conversations are happening at work. And now we're starting to see that it's starting to have an impact on people's productivity, on the way they work, on the quality of their work, things like that.
Sure. And those are some really interesting numbers that you quoted just there. Most people think it's inappropriate to talk about politics at work, but then we just can't stop ourselves. And so it's interesting to me. So I think everybody agrees that we're facing an unprecedented election this year, one that, strongly contributed to the figures in that study, I'm sure. But do you think there are other factors at play here that may have contributed to an increase in political discussions at work this year?
Yeah, so the other factor at play here is, there have been reports of recent increases in things such as hate crimes and hateful language on the basis of things like race, gender, national origin, religion, etc. For instance, a 2019 FBI report found that hate crime violence is at a 16-year high. I'm not here to personally determine the cause and effect here, but the other big factor here is that we have to be super clear about the difference between political discussions and hateful language, hateful actions, right? And this year, I think a lot of people would say that, making that distinction is as important as ever.
For sure. In general, 2020 has been just one hit after another. We're all stressed from, social unrest to fires and hurricanes, to murder hornets. I think there's an actual asteroid predicted to strike the day before the election. The truth is, if we don't laugh, we cry. So how much has this problematic year fed into the political divide that we're seeing in work?
Well, I think you're definitely right. Workers have been thrown a lot to deal with this year. I think the way that it's fed into the way people have political conversations is I think people have begun to become desensitized to some really difficult subjects, right? Can you imagine having a conversation with your boss a year ago about, your likelihood to die because of a pandemic, right? No, right? And all of a sudden,
Yeah.
I'm talking really blasely with my manager about like, oh yeah, well, if I die, blah, 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 right? So I think because the hits just keep on coming, I think people are becoming a little bit desensitized to some of this.
Well, we sort of jokingly referenced a minute ago the murder hornets and that sort of thing, but social media definitely has an impact. What kind of role do you think that social media plays in fanning the flames in the workplace?
So I'm not personally an expert on the role of social media and kind of the way it's impacted these political discussions. But one instance that I have been covering that I think is relevant to this discussion is the case of Julie Briskman. And you may remember her as the cyclist who was captured flipping off the president,
Mm-hmm.
right? And the photo went viral. And the next day, she informed her HR department that who was government contractor Akima. She informed them that she was the person in the picture, and they went on to fire her.
Mm-hmm.
Think the way social media I have seen really concretely play a role in some of these discussions is, who you bring onto social media also impacts your job. If you bring hateful language onto social media, that may impact your job. Or in the
Mm-hmm.
case of Julie, right? I think, if you display such an opinion on social media, for better or for worse, it can sometimes have repercussions down the road. Now, Julie went on to sue actually her employer,
Mm-hmm.
actually went on to run for public office. So I believe she actually now holds a local office position. It's complicated. I think social media just kind of adds that complication.
Yeah, but I think you're spot on there about, knowing who you are and reflecting that, within social media as well as, in person.
Mhm.
So in the introduction, we talked on about a few of the problems that can come from this politically heated work environment. I want to dig into that a little bit. What's at stake here for companies today with this politically charged environment?
Yeah, so I thought about this a little bit. I think there are three kind of general categories of what's at stake. There's, the health of your workplace culture, right? You want to make sure that everybody feels like it's a good place to work. Stress. The survey that found that 47% of people say the election has impacted their ability to get work done. About a third people said it's because it makes them more stressed. And third said that it distracts them. And that leads to the third big category, which is productivity. It can also impact your productivity, not only because you feel like you're constantly on Twitter looking for the latest news or what the president has said or, what person he's called out today, right? But also because if you've had a political disagreement with someone at work, a lot of the people in the Gartner study they found were avoiding those people. And I spoke with Brian Kropp, the vice president of Gardner, and he pointed out, like, how hard is it to get your team to be productive when half the people are avoiding the other half the people, right?
Sure.
So
Yeah.
I think those are the big things at risk are workplace culture, stress, and productivity.
Yeah, for sure. And I think it's probably a huge distraction as well from keeping the business's goals in mind, and all of us working toward those goals. So we talked a little bit about how these political discussions and these charged environments can affect your workers on site. What about remote workers? Is there a potential there for misunderstandings or that same kind of feeling for a remote worker?
Yeah, no, this issue can definitely still impact remote workers. I mean, I think one of the problems with everybody working remotely right now is you have to be really, really careful about the way your tone comes across. I think sometimes when we're in person, we're able to read situations more clearly. But I think, it takes a special skill to be able to have these types of conversations remotely, I think. And beyond that, I think it also just means we're separated from each other, right? It means that we are more likely to be with people who have the same opinions as our own. We're in our own little families. So because maybe we're not having as many interactions with people who are different from us, it's possible that, people are getting, not as nuanced in their political discussions.
That makes sense to where, you might not think that saying something in a certain way is going to offend someone else, and it actually does. We've heard
Mhm.
for years, watch how you write things in an email; it comes out differently. Someone hears it differently than what you might say. So I can see where. I mean, do you think it's possible that it would be even more difficult with remote workers, like people offending one another or speaking out of turn, in terms of politics?
I mean, I think it's possible that some people definitely would find it more difficult. I think the thing that I've really stressed within my own internal team is that I was so grateful that I had kind of like goodwill built up with the people that I work with before the pandemic. So if I never said okay to my
Mm-hmm.
coworker,
Mm-hmm.
right? Period. They knew I wasn't mad. They just knew that that's how I talk sometimes. And we have this kind of goodwill kind of built up. But in some cases, people are working together with new people for the first time. And so I think you have to be really, really careful about how you conduct these conversations online.
It's funny how you say that. I was enlightened to the difference between okay, like the letters OK, versus the word OKAY, that they have a completely different tone. So that's interesting. All right, Abigail, we're going to take a quick sponsorship break right now. When we return, we're going to discuss some of the strategies for addressing political talk in the workplace. So stay with us. Is your company at risk for a union organizing attempt? The NLRB's numbers are in, and here's what they reveal. The number of union certification elections has roughly doubled every single month since the pandemic hit in April. Similarly, the number of employees eligible to vote in a certification election doubled in May, doubled again in June, and doubled again in July. If you look at year-over-year stats, the rate at which unions won certification went from just 55% in June of 2019 to 76% in June of 2020. Finally, in July, the total number of employees eligible to vote surpassed levels for the same month of 2019. But these stats don't mean a lot if you don't know where you stand. Projections wants you to find out if your company is vulnerable now with a free online audit. We'll dig into your culture, safety, and other internal factors, as well as external factors like a local presence. To do your own 5-minute assessment, go to bit.ly/organizing risk. That's bit.ly/organizing risk. Identify and address your challenges to avoid becoming part of the statistics. And we're back with CNBC reporter Abigail Johnson Hess. So, Abigail, the election is upon us. We've known it was coming. Were there things that we should have put in place, say, like last year, to minimize the effect of the campaign on our workplaces this year?
Well, hindsight is 2020. It's hard to look in retrospect, but the advice I have gotten from experts is there's kind of 3 plans of attack that workplaces can take. And they can either, one, ban political conversations on the clock, which is clear, but perhaps a little bit unrealistic, right?
Mm-hmm. Sure.
It's just how humans talk.
Right.
And they can provide option number 2 is they can provide training for how workers can have healthy and respectful conversations. The drawback there is it can still leave opportunity for bad actors to say disrespectful things, right?
Mm-hmm.
Or 3, they can host intentional guided conversations, times when workers are encouraged and allowed to express themselves. I think the problem with that is it feels a little bit less organic, a little clunky. How many people are actually going to show up to that event, right?
Mm-hmm.
So I think for a lot of workplaces, it's probably that kind of Goldilocks option. It's providing training and guidance for how to provide, how to have really healthy, respectful conversations, and making clear the distinction between a normal conversation about what's going on in the news and
Mm-hmm.
being disrespectful or hateful.
Yeah, I love that. That's really insightful. And I wonder if there's a blend there where you can guide those discussions. You're saying offer up a specific time, but maybe it's multiple times. Maybe it's
Mhm.
impromptu if you see that happening to kind of guide those discussions. I really like that. So
Totally.
as leaders, how can we tell if we've got a political problem in our workplaces, or if there's a toxic culture growing because of it?
I think the first question is you need to make sure that there's infrastructure in place so that you can find out if there are problems in your workplace. I'm working on a piece right now about how do we define toxic workplaces. And the number one thing people said is people need to be able to raise concerns without fear of retribution, right? So
For sure.
you need to make sure you have that infrastructure in place where people can raise concerns. Otherwise, you're never going to find out if there's a political problem.
Mm-hmm.
And some of the warning signs are things like, he keeps talking about this subject, it makes me uncomfortable, those types of concerns.
Mm-hmm.
And you also then need to be actively checking in with your employees, saying, do you feel respected? How are things going for you? So I think it's both. It's making sure you have that kind of behind the scenes infrastructure to make sure people feel like they're able to raise concerns, and then also actively, proactively checking in with your workers.
Yeah, I love that. I think that's good practice, regardless of politics.
Yeah.
Making sure you're checking in with your workers and that they're getting what they need, and
Mhm.
feel supported and heard. But if we do see some of these things happening in our workplaces right now, can we do anything to mitigate it, or is it really just too late if we haven't laid the groundwork?
You may call me an optimist, but I do think there are always things that can be done. I think people are capable of changing. I think people are capable of growing. I think if you're noticing an instance where someone is, being disrespectful in the way they bring up certain political beliefs at work, I think there are ways to have a conversation with them, saying, these are, you're absolutely entitled to your beliefs, but like we need to make sure we're talking with our coworkers directly. I don't ever think it's too late, but maybe someone would prove me wrong. You never know.
I would hope not, but
Yeah.
so we're talking about what we can do. Well, let's talk about what we really can't do. I mean, we can't stop people from talking about politics, can we?
Listen, there are workplaces that try to do it. I think it's a little bit naive.
Mm.
And I think also, there are a lot of conversations about what it takes to build a healthy workplace. And one of the ingredients in that is typically this idea that people should feel like they can bring their full selves to work.
Mm-hmm.
Politics impacts our lives. I think what you need to address is, making sure people are respectful, making sure if someone says, I don't want to talk about politics with you at all, that other person respects it, right? Things like that. But to be sure, there are workplaces that say we don't talk about politics at work. I just am a little bit skeptical of how that actually plays out.
Well, and it goes back to what you were saying a minute ago about bringing your full self to work. I mean, we need to have a respectful workplace where everybody does feel like that they can express themselves and make sure that they're respecting their coworkers at the same time. So let's talk about what some specific things maybe that HR professionals and other company leaders can do to minimize the impact of the election on their workplaces, on productivity, that level of distraction we talked about. What can they do to minimize that?
Yeah, well, I think those three things I said that were potential drawbacks, which are workplace culture, right? You can make sure that your workplace culture is healthy, that people feel that they can bring their full selves to work, that they feel happy. You can make sure you're minimizing stress by providing, benefits to take time off. You can, do all the things you can as an employer to make sure that you're helping workers manage their stress and their expectations. And that last one, productivity, specifically with regards to that 1/3 of those surveyed saying that they were less productive because they were hesitant to work with other people on their team. I think that has to do with team management, right?
Mm-hmm.
I think there is potential there for managers to kind of step in and be, lay out the ground rules of, how we talk to each other as teammates. How do we operate as a team? So yeah, I think there is definitely some potential there in terms of thinking about how we work with people who have different opinions than our own.
Sure. So talking specifically about remote workers and folks who might be working from home, are there any different strategies that you would say apply specifically to remote workers?
There are strategies that can be done to make sure that people are still having healthy conversations, even when they're remote. I think it has to do with, a lot of those same principles. It's about, actively working with your teams to make sure they all understand what it takes to be respectful to each other. But, I think we're going to learn a lot more in the months and years to come as remote work becomes more popular. I think that's just kind of the base level. I'm sure there'll be some good people doing work on the subject in the future.
For sure. And I think not even just around politics. I think, learning to communicate while we're working remotely that's been a leap for everybody.
100%.
So, Abigail, we're going to take some time out for another quick break. We'll be right back after this. You're listening to the Project HR podcast. I'm your host, Jennifer Oraqua, and our guest today is CNBC reporter Abigail Johnson Hess. And we're back. So, Abigail, we've been talking about the behavior of our employees during a political campaign, but these problems can extend to our leadership as well. Do leaders need to check themselves and own their behaviors with regard to bringing politics in the workplace?
Leaders absolutely need to be thinking about, how they talk about politics in the workplace, because oftentimes these cultural aspects kind of trickle down to the rest of your organization. You also have an opportunity there. You can see it as an opportunity. I think leaders have an opportunity to demonstrate, this is how we talk about it. With the most recent election, with the pandemic, with the most recent examples of protests within the Black Lives Matter movement, I have seen a lot of examples of leaders talking about how they talked about those subjects with their workforces, because those issues do impact their workforces. And so I think, making a statement with your team saying, I understand these things are going on in our lives. I've been thinking about it this way. I've been so grateful for XYZ. I'm really excited about us doing this in the future. I think that's one way leaders can kind of set the tone about how we talk about these things in the workplace.
So I wanted to ask you about we were just talking about leaders and whether they play a role in shaping the discussion. Do you think that companies need to have like a handbook policy about discussing politics or, personal opinions? Can you do that? Is that something that people should do?
Well, I think organizations should absolutely think about this and create some type of policy. I think, creating expectations in terms of, employees will talk to each other respectfully. They will not use certain
Hmm.
hate language. They will not use XYZ. I think those are really fair, understandable things that workplaces can do. I think saying that we're never going to talk about politics in the workplace, if that's your policy, great. I just think study after study kind of shows that people talk about it, even if they understand they're not supposed to.
Yeah, it's a little naive to believe that people are actually going to just zip their lip and not say anything at all. So
Yeah.
let's go into sort of those nonverbal expressions. People who are wearing buttons or shirts, or they've got a bumper sticker on their car, that can start discussions. Any thoughts there? What role do those kind of campaign materials play in these discussions?
Well, they absolutely are playing a role in these discussions. I think the most highly publicized example has been Goodyear, where there was a viral photo of their company policy, which is that they do not allow any of these types of materials to be worn by workers. And then following that, President Trump tried to get people to boycott Goodyear. So, I mean, I think workplaces, it's their right, I think, to set these types of policies. I am not sure if it's the most nuanced way to think about it, but every organization has to kind of set the standards for themselves, and I think the more thoughtful you can be about it, the better.
Hmm. And I think that the culture plays a role into that as well, like the
Mhm.
company culture as it exists, even without politics. So
Sure.
what happens after the election here? I mean, it's not like all this goes away on November 4th. How important is it for companies to remain vigilant in their efforts to minimize the impact of this after the election?
No, you're absolutely right. This will not all just disappear on November 4th. Politics are going to continue to impact people's everyday lives. I think there's an opportunity here to use this time to think about how do we as an organization like to handle these issues, and I think it'll pay off. Not only through the election, but after, because these issues are going to continue to happen.
Mm. Well, I don't want to end our conversation without mentioning the wealth of resources available for folks on CNBC Make It. Can you tell our listeners how they can find out a little bit more about it?
Yeah, you can check out CNBC.com, and then we are the CNBC Make It section. You can find me on Twitter, Abigail J. Hess. Yeah, we got a lot of great stuff on what it takes to create a good workplace, and we're going to be coming out with a series on toxic workplaces in the near future.
Yeah, you do have a ton of great materials on there. So I want to let everybody know that links to CNBC Make It, as well as links to Abigail's article and the Gartner study itself, will be included in the episode companion guide. So be sure to sign up for it today at projectionsinc.com/podcast. Right now, though, Abigail, it's time for our lightning round question. These are questions that we ask every guest of the podcast. Are you ready for this?
I'm ready.
All right. So in our topic showdown, in this episode, we've been talking about the impact of the election on the workplace. And this year, everyone has an opinion on who should be president. So Abigail, no worries. We're not going to ask you your opinion on that. But it is October. So our surprise to ask you about is Halloween candy instead. In your opinion, which of these candies is more of a trick than a treat? Candy corn or those weird little marshmallow circus peanuts?
I think circus peanuts are more of a trick than a treat, and I will be controversial and say that candy corn is a top ranking candy. I love candy corn. I know people roll their eyes at me for that, but I love it.
You and my 16-year-old, she loves those too. So, so tell me, what's the best book you've read recently?
I just read The Underground Railroad by Colson Whitehead. It's very, very good.
Excellent. I'll have to check that one out. So what's your favorite thing about what you do? What's the best thing about business reporting?
The best thing about business reporting is I get to speak with a lot of great people. I get to speak with experts and leaders. I also get to check in with, workers and students across the country. It's really fulfilling. I love it.
Love that. So what's the best piece of advice you've ever been given?
I'll give a shout out to my dad. My dad's always said, since I was very little, he said, be bold, which is really sweet. But I think the more practical advice that I've been given is that a former manager told me that the first year you ever have at a job, you're just going to be spending getting good at it. So I think that's really helped me, just thinking about each year at a new job, thinking about how I can get good at that job.
I love that. Inspires growth. All right, Abigail, our final question. Tell me who or what inspires you?
Oh, I'm a big soccer player. I played soccer through college, so what inspires me is I root for Arsenal. They inspire me. They're going to have a great season. I'm excited about that. And I also have been following the U.S. Women's National Team and the NWSL. So
I love that. I think we're all ready for the return to sports for sure.
Can't wait.
So Abigail, thanks so much for joining me today on this week's episode of Project HR.
Thanks so much for having me.
And thank you to our listeners. As always, this is your reminder to grab the companion guide for this episode at projectionsinc.com/podcast. We also want to let you know about a little celebration we have coming up this November. Project HR will be celebrating its 1-year anniversary, and we are so pleased and proud that we've made it to this landmark. We're grateful for every last one of our listeners, for every download and every subscriber, and we appreciate you tuning in week after week and making Project HR a part of your working life. One of the things we'll be doing to mark this anniversary is to hold a book giveaway, where one lucky listener is going to win a copy of every book featured on the podcast this year. That's well over a dozen titles from some of today's hottest business authors, just for being a Project HR listener. So stay tuned for more information on how to enter to win. That's it from me for now. Let's make it a great day at work.